People often ask me, how do you regulate a watch movement? Well, in reality, every situation is going to be different, no matter whether you're working on a modern movement or a vintage movement. What's important to be successful is to understand the principles of regulation and how to interpret the data you're getting back from your timing machine. Now, many people just put a watch in the mic stand and time the dial down position. They move the regulator arm and they get a rate as close to zero as possible and think that the watch is regulated, not realizing that all the other positional rates changed as well. How well your watch keeps time on the wrist is an average of the primary positions: dial up, crown left, and crown down. In order to be able to even regulate a watch, the movement has to be either newly serviced with no faults in the mechanism, or it has to be a brand new movement. If you try regulating anything with an old tired mainspring or dried up oils, you will end up chasing your tail around trying to get a decent rate. Today, I'm going to regulate a couple brand new NH35 movements from TMI, and I'm going to walk you through some of the principles and theory behind regulation so you can get the best results possible. Okay, let's start with the basics. You have dial down. This is dial up. We have crown up and crown down. And here's where most people get tripped up with dial positions. Most people think that this is crown left. In actuality, that is crown right. Dial positions are based on as if you're looking at the face of the watch. So unless you are part of the 10% population that's left-handed, when you're timing your watch and you're looking for crown left, you want the crown actually pointed to the right. This is very important because the real crown right is usually the weakest position of all the positions, because unless you're talking about a high-end movement, manufacturers hide the natural faults of the escapement in crown right. So that's typically going to be your worst position. And since probably the two most important positions to most people are going to be dial up and crown left, you want to make sure that you're looking at crown left properly. So now let's move on and let's regulate our first movement. So today I'm using the eTimer software on my laptop, and I have it set up to check 5 positions: dial down, dial up, crown left, crown down, and crown up. I only care about crown right when I'm working on higher grade movements. Now, each position goes through a 15-second stabilization period, and then it starts measuring each position for 30 seconds. Now, there's a ton of information in these numbers, all of which can also be figured out no matter what type of timing machine you're using. The two most important factors that we look at are the delta rate, which is the difference between the two most extreme individual rates. On this movement, they are dial up, which is 10.77 seconds per day, and crown down, which is 1.21 seconds per day. That gives us the delta rate of 11.98, which for a movement of this quality is good. So it should be somewhere between 10 and 15. So we're good there. Now, for a watchmaker, the delta rate is the most important number that we look at because it's a direct indicator of the overall condition of the movement. If your delta rate is too much out of there, that's telling you that there's a fault in the movement that needs to be corrected before we start regulation. The second is the means rate, or the average daily rate, which is the average of all 5 positions. Now, the easiest way to calculate the means rate in this example that we have here is to add all the positive numbers together, which in this case is 25.1. Then we just subtract that negative rate of 1.21, and that gives us 23.89. And then you just have to divide it by the number of positions that you're testing, which in our case here is 5. And that gives us your daily average rate, which in this case is 4.78 seconds per day. Now, these numbers are well within the specifications for this movement, so you could just leave it that way, and this watch will keep good time on your wrist. But students in my watchmaking course will know by looking at these numbers that the regulator pin spacing needs to be adjusted. So now we're going to see how much we can improve not only the delta rate, but the average rate as well. With the Edicron style regulator, you basically have two options. You can speed up all the positions, or you can slow down all the positions. The two main ways to do this are by adjusting the regulator position along the hairspring curve, or by adjusting the regulator pins closer or farther away from the hairspring. Since we know by the data we got the first time that we do need to adjust the regulator pins, we're going to bring them closer together, which should speed up the rate in all the positions. In order to adjust the block for the regulator pins, we need good magnification, and we need the Edicron adjustment tool. We're going to turn the block counterclockwise, and then we're going to check our gap, adjusting that gap as needed. Now, adjustments are made somewhere in the 10th of a millimeter, so you really want to take your time doing this. The hairspring still needs to be able to vibrate between the pins, and the rule of thumb is that you want the gap to be about the thickness of the hairspring on either side of the hairspring that's vibrating. Essentially, what is happening when you make the regulator pins closer to the hairspring is that we are making the active length of the hairspring shorter, which makes the rate faster. So now, just for the sake of time, instead of fast forwarding through the entire timing process, I'm just going to show you the results of the adjustment. So let's look at the results of adjusting the regulator pins. The first thing you'll notice on our delta is that we got about a 3-second improvement. We're down to 8 right now. And that is an exceptional delta rate. So a delta rate of between 5 and 10 is typically what you see in much higher grade movements. So the delta of 8 is good. Obviously, you can see all our rates went up, which is what we were expecting to happen. So we have an average rate of 40, but we'll address that in a second. That delta rate of 8, I also want you to look at the delta of the dial positions. Right now, we have a difference of 0.33 seconds per day. And what's even more amazing than that is that the delta of our pendant positions, all right, our vertical positions, is now 0.48 seconds per day. So that one adjustment really made a big difference. Now, you'll notice that we had a little slight drop in amplitude, but I'm not worried about that yet. It's a new movement. The amplitude is going to be what it is. So I think as we get further in, we'll probably see an improvement there. And the other thing I want to address is the beat error, because I know a lot of people are very concerned about beat error. Usually because it's one of those things that you can adjust somewhat easily, and pretty much anybody can do it. You don't need anything special to move the hairspring stud around. But as we know, um, beat errors below 1.0 milliseconds do not affect the rate of a watch. So even though we have a 0.63 and a 0.58 in there, I have no concern about that at all. And if a watch was being serviced at Rolex, they probably would want to see everything below 5 or 4.4 milliseconds a day, if not more. But it really doesn't make any difference. We don't have those. We don't have to work under those type of standards. Um, and with all things considered, I'm looking at the delta rate of 8 right now, and I'm real happy. So now we're going to make another adjustment, and we're going to start bringing all those rates down closer to 0. And we're going to do that by adjusting the regulator arm. So when I make regulator arm adjustments, I just like to use a small brass rod that has a notch cut in it. And I want you to look at the tab at the top of the regulator, and I want you to watch how small of a movement that is. Okay? You can see after we run our timing that our dial rates are almost identical. Our pendant rates dropped about the same amount, so they're all still very close together. But now look at this delta rate. We're down at 4.67 seconds a day. And means rate, though, is still a little on the high side. So our delta rate is getting better, and we made a big improvement on our average rate. So now let's go ahead and make another adjustment. Now, of course, when we're trying to slow the rate down, we're making the hairspring longer. So we're pushing the regulator pins toward the hairspring stud, towards the tip of the hairspring that's in the hairspring stud. If we were trying to make the rate faster, we would be going in the opposite direction. So watch how small this movement needs to be. It's barely perceptible. There it is. And now let's check our rate again. Well, now you can see that we have our dial down position at 5.65. Our dial up is at 7.15. And all our vertical rates are also very good. You'll now notice that we have a delta rate still in that 4 range at 4.95, which is, I mean, that's the kind of delta that you see in chronometers. So for this movement to be that low, this is exceptional. Basically, what that's telling us is that everything in this movement, as of right now, is operating extremely efficiently. And of course, we have lowered our average rate or our means rate down to 5.44 seconds a day. Now, could we lower that average rate a little bit more? We could, but you saw the amount of adjustment on the last adjustment we made, how small that was. There comes a point where, you almost need to say enough's enough. So we're going to leave it there, and let's get on to the next one. One thing that I'm sure many people don't realize is that production movements like this are almost entirely assembled and lubricated by machine. That means that the precision of application, as well as the amount of oil deposited into the jewels, is very inconsistent and it'll vary from one movement to the other. For what these movements are sold for on a wholesale level, there really is very little room for human interaction in the production process. That means that the regulator, as well as the regulator pins, are machine set as well. And this is the primary reason there is so much variation in the values you see on timing machines from one movement to the next. Well, looking at our numbers, you can see this looks pretty impressive. We have an overall delta rate of 1.27 seconds, which is phenomenal. And because of that, you can see that our delta between the dial positions is less than half a second. Our delta of our pendant or vertical rates is just over 1 second. And that's all a reflection of the delta. I mean, just looking at our rates overall, you can see how close they are. Now, the one thing is our average rate or mean rate is 8.6 seconds, and that's something that we're going to adjust now. All right, since we're running a little bit fast, what we're going to do is we're going to lengthen the hairspring by pushing the regulator towards the hairspring stud. And we're going to make a very small movement. And this tip up here is where I'm looking. So focus in, see how small this movement's going to be. And it can be difficult to make really tiny adjustments because you got to go really slow. And that was the adjustment right there. So now what I do when I'm doing these adjustments, I want to just check one position, and I can see that I overcompensated, and now we're running almost 10 seconds negative. So now what I need to do is I need to go in the opposite direction. I need to speed up the rate by pushing or shortening the regulator or shortening the hairspring, and in turn that will speed up the rate. So I'm going to check that one position again. We're getting pretty close. We're still about negative 1.5, and I want this position to be up on the positive side. So I'm going to make one more ultra small adjustment. And again, if you look at this point right here, and we'll see this has got to be really just a whisper of a movement. That was it. So now I'm going to run all the positions, and I want you to look at this. We have a delta rate of 1.8 seconds a day, which is incredible. And now our average daily rate is just under 2 seconds a day at 1.96. And again, the delta rate is an indication of how well everything's working together. And you can see this in the numbers. The difference in our dial positions are less than a half a second. We're just over a second of the delta of our vertical positions. The delta between the dial positions and the vertical positions is just over a second. I mean, it's like a second and a half, second and 3/4. So those are all really strong. But you'll notice that our beat rate is 1.0 milliseconds or better. And we talk about the delta rate, we talk about the beat rate or the beat error. Anything over 1 second can affect the timing. Um, that's the theory. And there are reasons for it. And I'm not going to go dive deep into beat error right now. But if this was my watch, I wouldn't touch anything. The beat error does not seem to be affecting anything. We've got good amplitude and we have a delta rate of under 2 seconds. But if you're a professional watchmaker, they're typically not going to want to return a watch to a customer that has a beat error. Um, usually over 5. If it's a real old vintage watch, you would definitely want to be under 1. But this is, we're pretty much one across the board. So what we're going to do now is we're going to adjust the beat error down to a little bit more reasonable range. We'll try to go under zero point 0.5 milliseconds. And then we'll see what that does and what further adjustments we need to do. Okay, so when we adjust the hairspring, we can either move it to the left or right. I usually start by moving it to the left, and that's our adjustment. So let's test this one position and see what it looks like. Okay, now you can see here that now we're on the negative side. So we actually moved the hairspring the wrong direction. You can see it's negative 0.3638, somewhere around there. So, but look at what it did to the rate of the watch, that one movement. So made a big difference. So let's go ahead and now we're going to adjust it the other way until we can get it down to a more reasonable area. So I'm looking at the arm in this area right here to judge how far I'm moving it. And that was a small adjustment. And now you can see we're on the positive side of the beat error. But we're pretty good. I mean, we're right at 0.2 to 0.3 milliseconds. So that's more than good. And now we need to address this fast rate that we have. So again, to slow down the rate, we're going to make the hairspring longer by pushing the regulator pins towards the hairspring stud. And we've got a pretty big adjustment to make. So if you look right there, that's a pretty sizable adjustment. Now we're going to just check the one position, which is dialed down. And you can see we're now at around 33 seconds. So let's go ahead and make another adjustment, get a little bit closer. You look right here at the tip, you'll see the adjustment right there. Now we're going to check that one position again. And you can see we went over just no, it settled in. Looks like it's settling in to around 9-10 seconds. So we're going to slow it down just a little bit more. And now we really need to make small movements. Okay, now we'll check this one position. And now you can see it's measuring out at about 2.6 seconds a day. So I'm going to go ahead and run all 5 positions again, and we'll see where we're at. All right. So the numbers don't look too bad. We do have a delta rate of 12.51 and an average rate of 6.76. And we've managed to bring the beat rate down to a very acceptable level. But now, when you look at the delta between the dial positions and the vertical positions, you'll notice that that is a little over 12. So that's something that we should probably address. Now, you could leave it just the way it is, but this is a regulation video. So to fix this, we're going to adjust the regulator pins, and we're going to expect it to speed up all the rates just a little bit. And there's the adjustment. And now, after running the 5 positions again, you can see the results are pretty amazing, actually. Our delta rate has dropped down to 4.15. Now, you'll also notice that we have a pretty consistent grouping of uh, rates for all the positions. The main thing that I would point out to you is that now the regulator pins are adjusted properly, which is really reflected in that delta rate. So all we need to do at this point is bring the or slow down the hairspring just a little bit, and let's go ahead and make that adjustment now. So again, we're just making the hairspring longer by pushing the regulator towards the hairspring stud. And then we'll just check one position. And that looks excellent. So now we can run all 5 positions. And here's what we ended up with. We have a delta rate now of 6.67, which is outstanding. And we have an average rate of 3.27. The delta between the dial rates and the vertical rates, again, is showing that the regulator pins are adjusted properly. The delta between the dial positions is right around a half a second, which is, I mean, you can't ask for much more than that. Now, I will say that the vertical rate or the vertical delta is 6.67, which, is pretty good. Um, but overall, this is, I would consider this a very successful regulation. Of course, the whole reason we did this to begin with was because of the high beat rate. I still contend that, on a personal watch, I would have left that because the delta and the average rate were even better than what we have here. But if you were doing this for somebody and you didn't want to have a higher beat rate, uh, this is the adjustment you can do. So that's it for this one.